Hello everybody, another day and another 911. Now, in many ways I am a very spoiled individual, and because I get to drive so very many wonderful, lovely cars on a regular basis, I will admit that a 911 to me doesn't really feel like a very special car anymore. That is until I sit in one and take it for a drive, because pretty much every 911 from 964 onwards, in my opinion, is a fantastic, wonderful driver's car. And I appreciate that for very many, they are certainly a dream car. Now, with any luck, this video will be going out as a second attempt at my 911 week, which you'll have seen a little version of a little bit earlier. If you haven't, go and check that out. This is a 997.2, the second generation 997, but more specifically, this is a GTS. And the 997.2 GTS really is genesis for that sub-brand. When it came out, it really was seen as a sort of run-out special, and I'm not sure people were ever sure that it was something that was going to be repeated. However, only a few years later, and it became quite obvious that the GTS was now going to be a mainstay of the Porsche catalogue. In fact, you can buy pretty much every Porsche product now in GTS form, except I think the Taycan. But when you can buy a turbo Taycan, Porsche really are a bit odd with their naming system, aren't they? So what did you actually get with your 997.2 GTS? The big thing was the power kit. In many ways, the 997 GTS wasn't necessarily anything you couldn't get with the Carrera S, but it was just a whole bunch of options presented at a very tempting price. So that power kit raised the engine from about 380 up to just over 400 horsepower. You also got these very tasty looking center lock wheels. You've got the side splitters, which I think are off a GT2, and a few different upgrades as well. This car has been quite nicely specified. It has very little Alcantara in it. The 997 GTS was really one of the first 911s I recall as a regular model that started having Alcantara as standard in place of leather. Those that have been watching the channel for some time will know that I'm not much of a fan of Alcantara, so I'm very glad to see plenty of leather in here. And indeed, all the controls, all the touch points in here are just about spot on. The 997 really is a high watermark for the 911. And as the GTS really is a high watermark for the 997, this should be one of the best 911s that I've ever driven. As it happens, it's presented here in possibly the least driver-focused specification, being a convertible with the PDK. However, there is a lot to be said for that combination. I've never been a fan of 911 convertibles. I just haven't. There's something about the shape, certainly with the roof up, that just doesn't work for me. I've always said, if you want a 911 convertible, just buy a Boxster. And this car isn't really going to change my opinion on that, but hey, you pays your money, you takes your choice. And as traffic is currently preventing me from showing you the fun side of the car, let's talk a little bit more about the boring side. In terms of that paying your money and taking your choice, this is a very temptingly priced GTS 2, up for sale now at £40,000. There was a time, not too long ago, when buying any 997 GTS would have required a fairly serious investment, and in fact, these cars have held still about 50% of their value from new, even about a decade on. That is pretty incredible. 911s have always been good in terms of residuals, and the GTS model particularly so. And that is a big part of the problem, but I'm going to get onto that in just a little bit. If you've driven a 997 already, particularly a second generation one, there's nothing in here that's really going to stand out all that much. There's a good amount of leather in here, I quite like it. The steering wheel is very nice, it's fairly plain, it's free of buttons. Oh, they are on one today. Today is the day that the pubs have reopened here in the UK, and apparently everybody is desperate to go and get themselves a pint. Gonna make life interesting for doing my review, I can say that much. The second generation 997, if you were somehow unaware, is perhaps best known for introducing the DFI engine, and that means that for the first time in a long time one was able to buy a 911 without fears of the engine just grenading itself at any point in time. Now I'll leave the comment section and the internet in general to debate just how much of a problem early 997 and the 996s were, but it's generally accepted that this was a better, more robust power plant. However, I haven't always loved the way that these sounded, certainly not as standard, but this one's pretty good. Such is the age of this car that it actually has down here an exhaust button, which does things. Let's see how good this sounds, shall we? Pretty good, although not anywhere near as vocal as something, say, like the 981 Boxster GTS that I drove not too long ago. Most importantly though, it is all genuine sound. There are some dynamic flaws in this car though. This first generation PDK, and I know I'm going to get a lot of stick for this, it's very good. It's a huge improvement over the old Tiptronic box, but it just isn't the same as the modern system. There's nothing inherently bad about it, but if you're used to a modern dual clutch, this one just isn't as razor sharp. And I know people are going to tell me I've got it in the wrong mode, so what am I going to do? I'm going to switch from Sport to Sport Plus. And handily, this car has a button that you can tell the suspension to stay in normal. So here you go, here's Sport Plus, here's an upshift. It's slow, there's a little delay. Not enough to ruin your fun. It's way better than some other systems I've used. The downshifts are fine. The steering is also not quite as pin sharp as some other 911s I've driven, but again, by any normal measure, it's very good indeed. Wind noise in here, as you might be able to tell, we've got the wind deflector up. It's pretty decent. And happily, the ride is excellent. This is one area where the 911 has often trumped its lesser siblings. It really does feel like a very mature car, this. And that engine, 400 odd horsepower, sounds pretty pokey, and it is decent, but this being a naturally aspirated unit really does need revs to get the very best from it. In fact, these DFI lumps always felt like they had a little bit less torque than the outgoing engines, which always seem to have a lot of low down and mid-range punch. This one, you really need to work to get the best from it. Of course, I'm sure if you had the coupe version of this car in manual, as a driver's tool, it would probably be somewhat improved, but there isn't really anything that wrong with this as much as I might like to moan about it. So why then, if this car is really that good, have I put up the big clickbaity title? Well, it's simple really. It's changed the way that people look at 911s. Time was, and this isn't very long ago, that you'd buy a basic 911 if you wanted the purest experience, but most people really went for the S with a few options because they had to live with it on a day-to-day basis and they were always wanting to get the best residual values, and so went for something with the Bose and the nice seat belts and the sports exhaust and all that jazz. And that's perfectly fine. But when the GTS came out, people looked at it and went, oh, that actually is the best of the normal 911s. You had an awful lot of rhetoric as well about this being a baby GT3, which I can assure you, it is not. It is not even close to a 997 GT3. It's an entirely different animal. And that in many ways is a good thing. There's still a big old gap between this and the GT car. But when people realised that the GTS was going to become a regular thing, interest in the regular Carrera 2S seemed to dry up somewhat. Still a good selling model for sure, but for the ultimate investment potential, and I absolutely despise that as a concept, the GTS was the one that people wanted, and therefore it was the car that people wanted to wait for. And Porsche very quickly realised this, and now you're in a situation where the GTS appears pretty much straight away. It's no longer a model that you have to wait a few years for. It's a car that's available from the off in every product that they make, apart from the Taycan. Where's the downside to that then, I hear you cry? Well, what that means is that where people were once very satisfied to buy a fairly entry-level basic Carrera, now they're all being told that actually the one to buy is the GTS. And that has had the effect of pushing the real-world prices up by quite a bit. You see, if you compare the price of a basic no-options 911 to that of the same thing 10 years ago, they don't seem to have gone up all that much. The difference is that 10-15 years ago, we were far happier to buy a car with a lot less options on it, whereas now a 911 has become something that is all about the specification. You could argue, somewhat successfully, that that has always been the case, but the cars didn't seem that price sensitive because of it. People have always wanted their perfect 911, and because Porsche have been kind enough to make quite so many of these, it's often been easy to find that perfect car, even second hand. But now, people's idea of the perfect car involves an awful lot of frippery that simply isn't essential to enjoying the 911 experience. It's even stuff like the Sport Chrono pack here. I know Sport Chrono has been a feature of the 911 for over a decade now, but ask yourself, have you ever used that little stopwatch? I know Sport Chrono now gets you quite a few other things, but why should it? Why do you have to tick that option box? Why is it that you should have to tick a box that gets you a better 0 to 60 time? I don't think there's any real hardware that's changing. They're just opening up some software for you. It all seems a little bit odd, really. And when the 911 should be a fairly pure driver's car, it seems very counterintuitive to me and just doesn't seem to be really part of the experience. There is very, very little to dislike about the GTS, and happily prices have now come down a little bit. Some of the 911 price hysteria from only a couple of years ago has receded, and so these are now available at pretty accessible prices. This one, probably the cheapest out there at 40 grand, and it's that cheap because it's got 81,000 miles on it. But guess what? That's not a lot of miles for a car that's nearly 10 years old, and I'm very happy to report that this car feels really solid. Nothing in here is creaking or rattling, despite the fact that some sneaky bugger has cut the roof off of it. It's a really nice car to drive, and as a daily, which is what this thing would be so good at, it's wonderful. That wide hip at the back you get with the GTS means that this thing does look quite mean. Not a big fan of the silver paintwork, but other colours were available. Same goes for the centre lock wheels, really, with the kind of polished edge and black inner. Not a fan of that, but hey, you can have them refurbed however you want. But this car does just seem to work. Unusually for a 911, probably because of the PDK gearbox, this isn't actually even geared stupidly, with second taking you up to the national speed limit and third not being obscene. And that is a refreshing change, which means that you can enjoy this engine's fizzy top end. Necessary too if you want to make decent progress, because it isn't really until about 5,000 RPM where this motor really comes alive.